Hey everyone, this is Tim Chavez from Faith Matters. Before we get started, we just wanted to give you a quick note that this episode does contain frank discussion about sexuality, so you can determine if it's appropriate for anyone listening in. For this conversation, we were really happy to bring on our good friend and one of our favorite people, Jennifer Finlayson-Fife, and we know that many of you are fans of her and her work too. For a long time, we've wanted to have a discussion with Jennifer about the concept of modesty, something that anyone who's grown up in our tradition is intimately familiar with, and which has certainly driven lots of opinions over many years. And we were really glad to be able to talk through several aspects of this topic with her, including the different experiences for men and women, how our cultural definition of modesty can often be too small, and the principles behind the practices. But once the conversation got going, as it always does with Jennifer, it led back to something bigger, about how all of this, including our sexuality, points toward the ability to have deeper embodied joy, and how there is a real wholeness waiting behind a developmental process that each of us need to go through, including with our own sexuality. Jennifer is a licensed clinical professional counselor with a PhD in counseling psychology from Boston College, where she wrote her dissertation on LDS women and sexuality. She leads both in-person and online courses, workshops, and retreats, helping people increase their capacity for deeper emotional and sexual intimacy. You can find her podcast, Conversations with Dr. Jennifer, on all major podcast platforms, and find out more about her work at finlayson-fife.com. We should also mention that Jennifer will be presenting at this year's Restore Gathering in October. We're super grateful to Jennifer for coming on and really think that you're going to enjoy this episode. And with that, we'll jump right in.
All right. Well, Jennifer, we're so excited to have you in the studio. It's been a long time, and we have wanted to talk about this topic for years with you. So thank you so much for coming back and doing an episode with us.
My pleasure.
So I think I would love to start by hearing you define modesty, because I think in our church we have a special preoccupation with sexual modesty in the context of how we dress. And I know that for you that this topic is so much more broad. And so maybe to frame the entire conversation, it would be helpful for you to just define that for us.
Sure. So, I mean, I think in general, we think of modesty as a virtue because we are not flaunting strengths, assets, good fortune. It's a way of just being considerate of other people and, in a sense, being humble about the good things you may have in your life. So if you're modest about your wealth or you're modest about, any other positive thing, I think sexual modesty is a version of that and might be that you're not flaunting your sexual assets, I suppose. You're not excessive or working an interaction with your sexuality. That is the focus. And I think that one reason why maybe we focus on modesty, so there is that just idea of being kind of kind and humble and respectful of others. I think also the way that modesty is also defined and focused on is that we do use the issue of private versus public or covering up versus revealing as a way of trying to modulate sexuality or shaping kind of, are you someone who I'm close to or are you a public person? And every culture has different definers of what that is and where those lines are drawn, so to speak. And therefore, there are meanings that those communicate and express based on the cultural ethic around what is an appropriate public form of clothing.
So is the public and private, are those cultural lines as a starting point ever problematic by themselves? Like, is it
yes.
No matter how conservative or liberal they are?
I would say so. I mean, I think in a sense, the way that we can talk about all this because I think there's also the issue of how we regulate sexuality and who's responsible for what. And I think that it can be problematic if you're saying, well, in fundamentalist Islam, you're basically saying you can't show any of your body because of your sexuality being a problem and it may create feelings in men. And we do a version of that ourselves. And so, I think if the clothing lines I'm going to argue, are constricting your freedom and your ability to live your life and to do things that matter, then we're taking it too far. We're saying that managing sexuality is so important that you can't actually be a full and whole person.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you see this issue of sexual modesty as something that's totally cultural, or if there's something deeper to it. Like, I was actually doing some research. I don't know if you even call it research. I was doing some internet Googling. That's it.
Exactly.
Well,
research.
For people like me, we like to call it research. But like it turns out the best estimates place Homo sapiens appearing on Earth something like 350,000 years ago. And if Steve Peck's listening to this, sorry, Steve, I know I'm getting these dates kind of wrong. But like clothing appeared something like 100,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And so you could argue that Homo sapiens maybe were wandering around naked essentially for 250,000 years. Yeah. So how did modesty really emerge to have such a cultural importance in so many different ways? And does the fact that maybe it is cultural, should that influence how we think about it?
Yeah. So again, I'm no anthropologist or anything, but I would maybe argue, or I would speculate, that with the development of the prefrontal cortex and more ability for self-awareness and awareness of others, and sexuality starting to take on more meaning, right? And it's not just about copulating and reproduction. You become capable of expressing desire and desirability and so on. Well, self-measurement and self-assessment. And so I think that as we became more self-aware and self-preoccupied, then clothing becomes a way of managing shame, managing exposure, managing, just a sense of private and public that's growing with our social awareness.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I do think there's a sort of biological piece to modesty, given the prefrontal cortex, given the meaning that we can't help but have. Like, dogs are not capable of making love. They can only copulate. We can bring all this meaning, and therefore we're regulating meaning in part through clothing.
Okay.
So it feels like that brings us to maybe another framing question. Talk about this idea of a sober driver and the way that we teach sexuality in men versus women.
Right. So I do think there's a biological piece, and then there's a cultural piece that we make it worse and problematic of. And so that is to say, I think given how men and women are wired, there is an aspect of, meaning with testosterone and the psychobiological differences between men and women, more where men are in pursuit and women are pursued, right? Women are sought after. Even women focus on women around sort of what defines attractiveness, desirability, beauty. And so there is a kind of natural aspect of men desiring and women being desirable, okay? That I think has a biological piece. That doesn't mean that men don't also want to be desired and women don't also desire, but that's sort of a dynamic of sexuality that is a kind of foundational piece in this conversation. But I do think culturally we often overburden this issue when we're talking about gender roles and men and women's differences. And a lot of my research and work has been around the way that we have really spent a lot of energy in defining what women are in particular.
And when you say we there, are you talking about church members?
Culturally, church members, exactly.
Okay.
Thanks for the clarification. But yes, just even in our church cultural parlance, a lot around women's roles, what women naturally are. Men are less in need of definition, it seems. Women are more in contrast. But that is to say, we talk about men as being agentic and active, and women as more passive and receptive. When I was writing my dissertation, the Young Men's, Young Women's Manual had 2 lessons. Men was choosing an eternal companion. The Young Women's was preparing to become an eternal companion, right? So it's just the way we talk in terms of agency and non-agency. Men act, women are acted upon. So this translates also into how we think about sexuality. Men are naturally sexual. In our cultural thinking, men naturally desire, they assert, they want. Women are desirable, and the most desirable feminine, the way we culturally have talked about it, is to be relatively desireless, selfless, pure, non-sexual, innocent, right? And the kind of cultural fantasy is you'll be innocent and clueless until the day you marry, and then it's going to be a fantastic, right? And just that sexuality will turn on for the husband only. And that's maybe the way we want it. But because we have that cultural meaning, we often then think of women and girls as the gatekeepers of men's sexuality, because they're the sober drivers, right? They're the ones that are, the men are just barely keeping a handle on this. They're white knuckling it because they're, and so we're teaching girls that they need to cover up and manage those lines because the men are struggling with their sexuality. And so in that selfless servicing frame, we often overburden women with being the ones that are managing men's sexuality.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like you're saying, though, that there is some wiring that sort of directionally leans that way in the first place.
Yes.
But maybe culturally we've taken it too far, and that's probably too simplistic. But there's also responses that could say, well, even though there's some wiring, the culture takes it even further. We should like pull back completely and make this dynamic between desirability and desiring and the way you dress on both sides, like completely, and again, of course, completely equal. Uh-huh. Is that the response, or should
I think it's the response for some. It's not how I tend to think about it. I mean, so on the one hand, when I was in Young Women's, we had makeup nights. Now, I loved makeup nights. Okay. So it's, men are out learning how to do stuff, tie knots and everything. And I was learning how to do eyebrows. But,
right.
So, and so there's a certain amount of that is, part of that, the feminine, we're all a combination of masculine and feminine. And that's a part of it that I think is a perfectly legitimate and valuable part of being human, is, understanding desirability and understanding, what that's about. But I think that the way that it got problematic for me was the idea that to be desirable was like the definer of who I was, that I needed a man to choose me, that I needed to be pure enough for him, that I was bringing my sexuality to him. Those are much more about defining a self through another person, as opposed to defining and creating a self within yourself. And so you can still enjoy desirability, enjoy the feminine if that's, the direction that you lean and like, but still forge a solid self. What we do when we talk about roles so much is we are trying to create selves that are validated by the other, right? So I need and you need to be needed. We're looking for a self through being needed by the other person.
And what about the person that's hearing this and saying, well, sexuality though is fundamentally relational. Like how does one define a sexual self?
Yeah. It is fundamentally relational, but just like, an intimate partnership, a marriage is fundamentally relational, but one needs a sense of self to share, right? One needs to forge a sense of who am I and what matters to me. A lot of us, when we're immature, we look to a partner to give us our legitimacy. We look to a partner to make our sexuality acceptable. We're hoping somebody else can take away our anxieties and uncertainties. One way we teach women to do that is be needed, be necessary, be a role fulfiller, be the backup, the support staff for the main show of the husband. And that's often in the desire. The reason why women often want to do that is they want to feel that they're valued. They want to get that sense of self through that role. So it's not, and just as a man wants to feel strong and able by being the strong one, the provider, the one that's making her life good. These aren't terrible places to start. It's where most of us do start, but it's time limited, because if you need the other person to make you okay, it fundamentally limits how intimate you can be, either emotionally or sexually. If you can't be at peace with the fact of your sexuality, the fact of your desire, the fact of your capacity for eroticism, you're going to limit how much you know it yourself, and certainly how much you let a spouse in on it. And so we need to be able to come to peace with our sexual nature that is a gift to us from God. And it doesn't mean that, you must be a chooser around that. So you can receive it and value it, and then choose wisely with it to create the reality that you want in your life. Like, that's very important. But even that choosing aspect is really fundamental to that sense of integrating your sexuality and being at peace with it as an individual.
So is that how you would teach masculinity and femininity? Like, it feels like we want these opportunities to celebrate what's different, and it feels like maybe that's where lessons might go off the rails. Like the intention was to say we're different, and that can be great.
Yes.
But how do you do that without perpetuating this sort of accidental objectification of ourselves, maybe?
Well, right. I mean, when we're getting too fixated on sort of telling people who to be, right, it's suspect. That is that there's kind of a need in it. I need you to stay in a certain place. And women can do this to men, and men can do this to women. I need you to define yourself in a way that makes me comfortable or gives me a role with you, which is different than celebrating the differences of masculine and feminine difference and valuing them as truly equal, having unique gifts, and understanding that all of us have some combination of masculine and feminine. Mm-hmm. I sometimes prefer the yin yang way because it's not so, women are feminine and men are masculine. We're all a combination of those capacities. And if you think of Christ was a combination of what are considered ideal feminine and ideal masculine traits. As we evolve as humans, we tend to develop more. So we may start out with strong yin qualities, for example, as a child, but start developing more of the yang as a part of becoming a more whole and integrated person. That said, when we become more solid in ourselves, often then two things. One is that we can more deeply embrace who we are. So we may have developed more qualities from the spectrum of characteristics, but don't apologize for the feminine. We're not being feminine because we want people to tell us we're okay. It's because we're being ourselves and we enjoy that part of us. The other thing is that we can have this balance of qualities within our lives and be able to be assertive when we want and be able to be receptive when we need to. But in sexuality, really enjoy what I call polarizing. So in good sex, it's often we're enhancing the feminine, enhancing the masculine. C.S. Lewis talks about this, like that in good sexuality, it's like you can, he says, first of all, the way we've sort of ruined sex is when we have manuals that talk about the proper way to be sexual, right? He says what we really need is this spirit of laughter and joviality and sort of the ability to laugh at ourselves. And that we polarize. And so he talks about men can wear a paper crown in sex. And what he means is you're not really the king, but you might like pretending like you're the one. Okay. And the feminine, he's like, of course, in real life, it would be terrible if, a woman were to act so helpless and so on. But in good sex, you can kind of polarize into these, actor acted upon, desirer, desirable. And it's a part of good sexuality, but we tend to want to enhance when we're specifically being sexual.
We should mention that the PDF of the paper crown is available on faithmatters.org.
Yes.
Okay, fine. We have to cut it. It's fine. I just could not see it.
I was just gonna add, like, the ironic thing to me is that you have to, for that dynamic to be playing out in the bedroom, it makes sense to me that you have to come to that place with some wholeness. Like,
absolutely,
you have to come whole.
It doesn't work if it's actually the way you live. Right. It's, I've worked with couples where that's actually going on too much in the marriage. He's too dominant. He's too demanding. She doesn't want to do any of that playing because it's not play, right? This is a way of playing. You're playing with these identities and roles and aspects of self, but it's playful. When it's real, then it doesn't feel good.
So before we move on from this sober driver framework, talk about how this is affecting young men or men who are not necessarily in sexual relationships. Like, is this problematic for them too?
It is, because I think, well, two things at least are problematic about it. One is that I feel sorry for men, often young men, who feel their sexuality kind of coming on board in adolescence and are getting taught the idea that this is a threat to their goodness and their spirituality, right? And so it is sort of this internal threat, like they're naturally sexual, the culture gives them that, but it could divide them from God. It could be destructive to them or a woman, right? So women are acted upon, but men are often being taught like that she may not really want to be acted upon. And so that is to say that they fear being destructive with it, especially when you're socialized into the role of being a protector. And so there can be a deep ambivalence in men. And often men are taught the idea that the sexuality is stronger than they are. And that's just not the right way to think about it, because it means you're in a real ambivalence about sexuality, as opposed to, look, this is going to feel unruly sometimes and this is going to feel difficult, but your role is to figure out how to handle your sexuality and to create good with your sexuality, because you ultimately, as a good lover, as a man, want to be in a place where you value this and can love deeply with your sexuality. But that requires the capacity for breaks and being able to self-regulate and make good choices. But you don't want the idea that it's going to come and get you. You want to think of, I have something I need to kind of master in the true sense. I mean, like, not subdue it, but be able to regulate it and create beauty with it. So when you give the idea that you can't handle it and therefore women need to be covering up and they shouldn't be wearing that, and you get the idea that you aren't fully responsible and women are partly responsible, as opposed to, it doesn't matter what a woman is wearing. You still have to handle yourself and to handle your sexuality and your respectfulness of other human beings. That's just your job with the gift of your sexuality. So it's just giving men the idea that they are ultimately responsible and that it's never someone else's job to handle this. That's just important, but it's also important because if they want to have good sex in marriage, they never want to give the idea that their wife is partly responsible for it, for many reasons. One is that if you put her into the maternal caretaker frame, she will never be there out of desire. She will be there out of duty, which is a very different energy than one of desire. I've worked with women who, dress modestly to help handle the sexuality of the men around them. And then in marriage, maybe their spouse was looking at porn or whatever, but they just didn't, even though they liked sex, they didn't feel free to really surrender to the pleasure in it because they thought they were leaving their post. Like, if I'm not standing guard, who is? Right? Because he certainly doesn't seem to be. And that's what I've been told is my job. And so there's never a real freedom if each doesn't learn to come to peace with their sexuality, learn to make wise choices with their sexuality, and therefore show up and be capable of engaging in a loving sexual interaction in marriage. But you need a certain amount of ease with yourself to be able to be creative and express yourself in that realm.
Yeah.
I love that.
And can I ask one more question?
Sure.
And this is, before we move on to the sort of maybe bigger part of the conversation, and this is coming from the men's side again. I'm curious if you were a young men's leader tasked with teaching the law of chastity, because like I imagine when you were getting modesty lessons, we were getting control your thoughts,
Yeah.
which I don't think is, I mean, it's getting at something good. Like you said, mastery is a true and healthy part of developing one's mature and mature sexual self. But for me, that kind of spiraled into like shame and scrupulosity. And there's some certainly temperamental about me that caused that. I'm not necessarily blaming my leaders, but like, how do you teach this really mature point of view that's just not coming naturally to a young man?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that, first of all, making a distinction between feelings and choices and actions, right? So the feelings are just going to come. And for some kids, the feelings become the problem. Like, just the fact that I'm having that thought or that feeling or whatever, means that I'm sinning or I'm not a good kid or whatever. So just understanding that feelings are going to just wash over you all the time, and this is going to feel a little crazy at times. That you're just trying to move into a grown-up body and managing a lot of impulses. And I think I would be giving the message that this is going to feel unruly at times. And that's okay, and that's normal. And this is, believe it or not, a gift from God, okay? Mm-hmm. That learning how to get a handle on your body and your sexuality will happen with time and is a part of being able to ultimately love and be loved in a committed relationship. And so you're pointing them to the goal. Mm-hmm. And you keep that goal in mind. I mean, and you want your kids to self-define in some sense around that goal, which I could say more about. But, they need to own that's what they want at some level. And then, is this choice, is this action leading me closer or farther from that goal of being able to love and be loved in a committed relationship, right? So sure, you're going to see images that are very attractive. You're going to see women that are very attractive. You're going to see, you're going to feel feelings at times. That makes you normal, not abnormal. The question is, what am I going to choose around this? And will that choice bring me closer or farther from the goal of a committed, loving relationship? And so it just makes it less shaming. And if you make a misstep, everything's, terrible about you, because that creates more obsession and difficulty with integration. Where if you think, okay, there's nothing strange about the fact that that just makes me a human being. But what choice am I going to make around this? It puts you in that driver's seat, which is a very much more powerful position.
Yeah.
So I was just at lunch with a good friend who has had a lot of anxiety and has made so much progress and just feeling a lot more peace in her life. And something that she said that was so powerful, and it feels like such a subtle change, but it feels very relevant right now. She was saying, I just decided I'm going to stop giving so much credence to my thoughts. And she kind of had a shrug of her shoulders. And I just thought that's the difference. Like it's so subtle, but it makes all of the difference. It's I had this bad thought. Am I putting all of my energy into resisting that thought, or am I just letting it float by? And I thought it, and it means absolutely nothing about who I am.
It's 100% true. It really is. In fact, there's research that shows, I'm trying to remember the name of the researcher who did this. I can't think of it right now, but he was talking about the fact that people that tend to struggle with mental health issues versus those who don't, it's not the people that don't struggle with mental health issues are having aberrant thoughts. They're having antisocial thoughts. They're sometimes thinking things that are not ideal. They're sometimes thinking negative things about themselves, but they don't get hooked on it. They just kind of that's what humans do. They're just more accepting in a way of the human condition. Those that tend to be more scrupulous or anxious or whatever can often get caught on the thought. And then that creates more distress within the psyche and the person. And they're caught because they're trying so hard to resist the thought. Exactly right. Yeah. Exactly right. And
wow.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with this. Honestly, that was my mission experience. But I want to ask one more question on behalf of people, and not everybody's like this, obviously, but on behalf of people who are especially scrupulous. What is your perspective in terms of you kind of painted this picture, make a misstep, that takes you a little bit farther away, but just sort of get back on track. What do you really think in our church and in our culture is the appropriate response to a sexual misstep? Because here's, I think, a dynamic that plays out a lot. There's a sexual misstep of some kind. It could be as, in some people's minds, as small as a thought. It could be an experience with pornography. It could be going too far with a girlfriend or whatever. And then what happens, I think, many times is it's too shameful to feel like you can talk about that with your bishop,
right?
But you feel like God has not forgiven you until you have talked with your bishop. And so I think some people actually struggle and suffer with guilt and shame for years because of that impossible dynamic. I can't talk about this, and in order to be good with God, I have to talk about it.
Yeah.
So what, in your opinion, I guess, can people move on their own?
I'm just kind of speaking off the cuff, so I don't know if I'm even going to agree with myself after I say this, but
I do that all the time.
Exactly what you mean.
But I mean, I think that too often we talk in terms of, the bishop or church leaders in terms of getting clearance as opposed to pastoral care, advice, help me think through this, right? I'm struggling, I'm suffering. In the For the Strength, the new version of it, it was saying no matter what's happened, God is always there, right? Cares about you, cares about what you're going through. When I did my dissertation research, what was really striking was how many people felt they had taken missteps and then felt this sense of now they couldn't access God.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
it was, yes. And so now they were really out in the dark and alone, and they'd lost the spirit. But it was really a taught idea that they felt like, now I can't actually go. And so I really was glad to see that change in the For the Strength of Youth manual. But I think even if we talked about bishops and young women's presidents in that same light, they're there to help you think through it. And if we were concerned less with controlling our children and more about facilitating in them that internal reference point around, I want to achieve this goal of being in a loving, committed relationship, for example. This is how I want to be in relationship to my sexuality, and I'm struggling. Then you're more in a position to help them think through it. Why do you think you're getting stuck around that? What do you think might be helpful to you? But it's less, okay, I'm wrong and now I need someone to make me right, but more you have someone who's an advisor, someone who's shepherding you along the way towards what you're trying to create. And we really have a theology that's highly creative, right? It's about, right, that we can be in this act of sort of, what do we want to become? What do we want to create and do with the gifts we've been given? And a lot of times we think much more black and white and behavioristic and wrong and right. There's a place for that, but it's really not that helpful in developing into adult sexuality.
I love that vision.
I want to ask you another kind of delicate question. And I love that vision, and that's how our leaders can sort of nurture this more sexual wholeness. I don't like how that sounds, but that they can be like a player to help us be more empowered and find something that's a healthier way for us to engage with our own spirituality. But I'd love to hear how you think patriarchy itself often plays out, especially with women in cultures and in subcultures that are especially conservative.
Right. So when men have had the dominant voice, right, and they become the defining reality, women's sexuality and experience gets defined in reference to men's experience and men's reality. So even like Kinsey study, basically when they were defining the kind of the sexual response cycle, right, of arousal and so on. Well, that's men's sexual response cycle, okay? And so then women are like, what's wrong with me? Why do I take so long? As in, men are the standard of, 10 minutes to orgasm, and women are the aberration because they're 25 minutes to orgasm or whatever. And it's like, wait, how did men become the ones, right? Or like when women die in car crashes more often than men do, because seatbelts are created for men's bodies, right? So there's a lot of this when we kind of make man as normal and woman as, as different. And so a lot of what I'm even teaching in my course for women around sexuality is just to like help women understand about their sexuality and how amazing it is and how much capacity women have, because it's always been in reference to men. And if you're doing it as a race to the finish, men always win. Okay.
So to speak.
So when men have been the definers of reality, then it's been easy to say, well, if I'm not supposed to have these sexual thoughts in a conservative patriarchal culture, right? I'm not supposed to have these thoughts and feelings. Therefore, you need to cover up. You need to not do that. And there can even be contempt for women if they're creating feelings in men that they think they shouldn't have. And, and so, for example, when we traveled with my husband and our kids traveled for a little bit of time, and we were in some Muslim countries like Turkey and Morocco and so on. And I was dressed modestly by Utah standards, but immodestly by those country standards. And it was interesting because I would feel that some men would leer because now they had permission to, because I wasn't dressed properly, or it was giving the signal that I was a certain kind of woman. They didn't have to respect me. That's how it felt, like that they could sort of dehumanize, right? And so that's often the idea that if you don't do what you're supposed to, then I have permission to, I can take advantage of that. And that's obviously a very problematic idea.
But what do you do when you're in a culture where that's sort of the air you're breathing? If you're the woman in that, if I imagine you wanted to cover up, I imagine that made you feel like, I want to cover up, even though
I always had a
wrong.
Male chaperone with me. I never went out without my son or my husband. Yeah.
So, and I think that's a lot of what comes up for me, is that it feels like I'm recognizing there are some problematic things here, and it doesn't feel fair that women are the ones to fix the problems, but it feels like that's who's going to feel the tension if they try to break out of these things that aren't right in the first place. Like you can't choose for someone else to not be projecting this judgment.
Yeah.
And so
right. So there's a difference between judgment and safety. Okay, there's like an issue of safety, of course, and if this gets a little bit complicated. So one thing is that I think that cultures have meanings around clothing, and you're communicating a meaning based in the culture that you're in, and so you want to be aware at least of how that gets read. Like wearing a bikini to a young men's, young women's party in Orem, Utah is going to have very different meaning in terms of what is happening than if you are in Germany. You might even be overdressed in Germany, okay? In a bikini. So that is to say, like, there's different meanings around what's considered appropriate and what isn't. And you don't want to, like in any culture, you want to be aware of the meanings of what you're doing and make sure you're communicating what you want to be communicating right within that. On the other hand, they're outside of kind of meaning and whether or not you're communicating a meaning that you don't intend to, and that might jeopardize your safety. There's the issue of judgment and safety are different things. And so am I dressing in a way that I feel is self-respecting and respectful of others? Am I dressing in a way that Sharon Maxwell, she wrote a book on for parents of adolescents around some of these issues, and she talks about the sexuality quotient. Like, is the sexuality of how you're dressing appropriate for the task? So wearing a swimming suit to an exam, for example, the sexuality quotient would be off, as opposed to a different sexuality quotient when you're going to the beach, right? So just being mindful of what is the meaning context of the clothing, and are you functioning in a way that's respectful of yourself and others, which is different than whether or not someone might judge on their own standards of whether or not you're dressing the way you ought to.
Yeah.
I can imagine parents of, kids or teens listening to this and saying, okay, it's probably daughter, is not understanding the meaning that she's conveying. And again, it's probably, if it's the swim party in Orem, Utah, it's probably not a safety issue. It's a judgment issue, right?
Yep.
But my daughter's not understanding the meaning that she's conveying when she goes to that party or to church or whatever. And I want to teach her something without shaming her or making her feel bad about what she's wearing or who she is.
I think I would just say there's nothing wrong that you enjoy that bikini and you look good in it. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that you like looking good and enjoying it. However, it's kind of a loaded choice in this context. And so I don't think you should wear it, right? It's just going to carry more meaning than I think is suited. I mean, it's not.
This whole conversation was a setup for that moment.
Yeah, it's not. It's just go put on one piece. It's not worth it. It's not worth it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just kind of like, why do it when you can just be perfectly happy? Now, if you're hanging out in the backyard with your friends, wear your bikini. Right?
Yeah, and as a parent, do you think we should be asking ourselves if we have mixed motives? Like if we've got feelings that are coming up, and we're trying to like put a whole bunch of lipstick on the, that's not a good analogy. We're trying to gift wrap this this idea in in JFF language, but it's actually just like something I'm pretty insecure about.
Yeah. So I think if you're managing how you're seen as a parent, right, and you are anxious about that, I think that's different. It's different. These things are a little bit tricky because it kind of depends. Like, so I'm just imagining, I'd be like, we're going to a award party, like just put on, it's not worth it. Like, but I don't think there's anything wrong with the fact that you like that bikini or you wearing a bikini sometimes, but it's just not there. I would just sort of say, I don't think you should. On the other hand, if I'm thinking, well, if they see that my daughter's wearing a bikini and they're going to think I'm a bad parent, that's just a terrible motive. It's not the right way to do it and to try to get them to make you look like a good parent. Yeah. So yeah, that's just one example of many versions of this, but yes. Uh-huh.
That's a very complicated part of the dynamic though, because I think we all come with our own baggage and it really flares up again when you have your own kids who are sort of challenging the unhealthiest parts of your own adolescence. You
Yeah.
know? But I like the idea that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And it feels like in any context where there's a lot of fear, we're more prone to be very all or nothing.
Yes.
And so I
exactly.
like the idea of just practicing articulating that this is not a God issue. This is not like a God disapproving of your body, but but it's loaded like that. I think that's a way that works. And there's a lot of authenticity there. And maybe it can work to just be more honest about our own things that are coming up. You know, I feel really anxious about this. And
even talking to your kids.
Yeah, even talking to your kids. Like I think I always go into this all or nothing place when I'm feeling worried about something. And so for me, it looks like I'm not having the conversation because I don't even know how to start because I know I have a lot of emotions. And I like the idea of just being more open in general about what we are wrestling with too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is just more loaded for parents in a place like Utah, for example, because I grew up in Vermont. I raised my kids in Illinois. There's just, I don't know. I just think it's less loaded, so to speak. I just don't think people are paying that much attention. Like just showing up at church at all is good enough, you know. And I don't think that I really felt much awareness of that. But it's, you know, it's interesting. I remember my daughter saying to me, like when she was 9, she would sometimes just wear tank tops and stuff. And I never thought about that. And she was like, I just used to always feel a little bit like people thought we weren't as good as Mormons because I was wearing that tank. So she was picking up on it more than I was actually.
Wow.
And so that was interesting to me. She said that to me like a few years after that. And I was like, oh gosh, I never thought about it.
I wanted to ask you about that though.
Yeah.
There seems to be like there's an age where kids start becoming more aware of what's private and what's public. And for at least some number of years, they're very unaware of that. And like modesty is not on their radar. So is this something that you introduce or that they'll start feeling gradually? You know, when do you start having these conversations?
A little bit of both. So exactly. It's like they may love running around the house naked when they're 3, and you may be completely fine with that in terms of your family's ethics and feelings about it. But when Mrs. Smith comes, just to say like, I know running around naked is fun, but for company, it's more polite, right, to put clothes on. So you're teaching that public, private at an early age, which is perfectly fine. It's just helping your child get socialized into managing the public world. They will naturally become more preoccupied with modesty around age 6. So they won't want you in the room. They'll want to close the door. And just respecting that private public distinction with them is very good for just even teaching them that their body deserves respect, their privacy deserves respect. So and then when they're 13 or so, they may become more aware of, hey, when I wear this, I get more attention than when I don't wear that, or when I, you know. And so then it may take on a different quality or dimension where they may be liking the validation and wanting to dress immodestly because they like feeling desirable. They like being able to command the pool party.
And then is that when you're having these sort of bigger what modesty really means conversations? Because part of me is like, I'm so happy for them to have a healthy body image. And like, if I could gift that to my 13-year-old self, I'd be all in. Yeah. So how do you manage both?
I don't think you should be talking about the sexuality of modesty before they're sexual, before they've hit puberty. I just don't think it's in their mind. They don't need to take it on. You don't need to sexualize them. You can just be talking about polite and impolite, you know, proper for this context, you know, if there's a need of a conversation at all, right? So, and that's all helpful for just understanding boundaries, personal and public. When they move towards sexuality, then there's more an issue of desirability and attraction and managing sexuality and thinking about self-respect and respect for others and what that means in one's culture and for one's choices. So, you know, I want to talk to my kids about it in terms of that they are not using their strengths, so to speak, to exploit another person's desire. Now that there's obviously the female version of that, but just to be fair for a moment, I'll talk about the male version of it, which is like growing up, there was a guy, I'm going to give him a pseudonym in case you ever listen to this. We'll call him Steve. And Steve had social he was attractive. He was like socially very capable, and he could make all the girls fall in love with him, and he liked doing it. And so he was immodest, in my opinion, in the sense that he had a strength, he had an asset, and he would use it to garner attention and validation. And if somebody sort of gave up, he would give just enough to keep them. And I think that's a way of taking advantage of other people because it feels good to you. And so if I were to see a son or a daughter doing that in any way, right, I would be talking to them about that. Like, I know that you like getting that attention for its own sake. I know it feels great, right? And it's still not very respectful of other people, even though you can do it, right?
Yeah.
And so talking about modesty as in the true sense of the word, of a kind of humility and dignity that I would say it feels great to be attractive. It feels great to enjoy your body, to be beautiful, right? There's nothing wrong with that you like it and that you want to wear the bikini. I get it, right? But it's also, how do you show respect for other people? And also, it's self-respecting on some level if you feel like your child is working their sexuality too much to get a kind of cheap attention, that it's a way of sort of limiting, I don't know. It's like sort of flaunting, and I think sort of works against their dignity.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, on the other hand,
yeah,
I think we're more versed in being able to talk about objectification in that sense.
Yeah.
That, you are making yourself an object for this person or vice versa. But it feels like sometimes we sort of do this in the opposite way, especially in the church. And maybe this is more common where, the culture is very dense, but talk about how we might make an object of someone for being especially modest or,
right.
checking every box.
Modest is hottest, that kind of stuff.
Forgot about that, Jim. Yeah.
Like, that's still objectification.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
that's just the other side of the coin, but it's the exact same problem.
It's the same idea of like, this is how you're going to be desirable. And so your goal is to have someone else tell you you're sufficient. And so the way you're going to do it is to be pure and to be modest and to do all these things. And you need to earn that in someone else's eyes. And that's just the problematic path. It's an easy one. It's the easiest way to tempt people into the right behavior, is tell them that they're going to earn, favor in the eyes of others by doing something. But it is a way of keeping the reference point outside of themselves and distracting from the question of who they are, who they desire to be, what their impact is on others, and what impact their choices have on themselves.
But how do you explain that? Because to a kid who is maybe, leans perfectionistic, that conversation, I'm afraid, would feel like, so, it's okay if your shorts as a 15-year-old are not touching your knees. It feels like you're sort of talking them out of standards, and which is totally not the intention. But I feel like to the ears of a less mature adult, they're with a developing brain, what they're going to hear is like, you're telling me to do this in a lukewarm way, and like I'm just going to do it all the way. So how do you communicate
talking
that
to my child about, if that's what they were doing, is more that I see them imagining that there are rules that they can obey and follow that are going to give them safety and give them dignity. They're trying to check all the boxes to find a security that's not really there. So I would just be teaching them to be kind of self-aware, right? It's a guideline to wear shorts like that. It's a good guideline, no problem. But the safety isn't in the clothing line, right? It's figuring out what is actually right for the purpose and what is self-respecting and respectful of others.
It feels like the new For the Strength of Youth pamphlet is going to make that so much easier, because you don't have a literal list.
Yes, that's right.
To judge each other and to judge yourself.
Right. It's much more the spirit of the law is there. Yeah. It's great. It's really a big step forward. And for kids to be reading that a lot, it's just kind of pulling their mind into a new way of thinking about it that's asking them to discern more, asking them to, what is the spirit of the law here? What's actually, healthy and good? What is actually drawing me closer to Christ? What's actually living in line with what I believe? It's the right muscle.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we've talked about several situations And I just want to draw a little bit of a finer point on something we've been definitely on a little bit. But these situations where we're making certain decisions in order to sort of manage what other people think. So whether it's dressing in a certain way to avoid a sexual gaze, or dressing in a certain way to gain a sexual gaze, or having your kids dress a certain way to avoid judgment from sister so and so. If you zoom out a little bit as just a therapist, is it ever healthy to make decisions in order to manage what other people are thinking, even outside of the context of
I would
modesty?
say yes, but that might just expose my underdevelopment. I'm not sure. But I think it's a little bit around public and private, I think, and sort of going along with the culture on some level, unless, to just, in some ways, to manage how much of yourself you need to explain. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just how much am I going to let people in on who I am? And there's a certain amount of going along that does that. But except for when it really is eroding your dignity, or really eroding that you feel that you're betraying something in yourself to go along with it. Right. So there's a lot of things that we go along with, not because it's what we would choose or how we would do it, but we're just going along with the group as a way of belonging to the group, as a way of fitting in. And there's a certain amount of that's just normal and healthy, in my opinion. You get together for a family reunion, everybody's doing a little bit of that if it's going well, right? It's when you feel like you're giving up so much that you're actually falsely presenting yourself, that you're actually trying to keep an image alive because you can't handle someone knowing who you actually are. Then there's more of a self-betrayal in that management, right?
So there's sort of like a broad area of behavior in which we can be true to ourselves. It's not like a single narrow path. And as long as we're acting within that broad area, we can, well, to be a bit circular, remain true to ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's stepping outside of that that could be problematic.
Yes, exactly. It's when you feel like you're living deceptively, and you feel like it's out of your own shame or your own inability to handle invalidation. I would say then there's something to renegotiate in terms of how much of yourself you let others in on. Humans like to control each other. Humans like everybody to be the same because it makes us feel more comfortable. And there is a place where here's the guardrails, here are the guidelines, here's what we do. We have them in every culture, every group. This is how you do school. This is how you do, anything. So there's nothing wrong with that. But ideally, you're not saying that that's the end point. That's the beginning point. And so, it's a slothful servant that's commanded in all things. We have to ultimately, internalize those frameworks and those understandings, but then start thinking for ourselves and discerning for ourselves. And what's the spirit of this principle? And how does that apply to me and my situation? And so, we have to be careful that we don't make an idol of these kinds of ideas that are starting points, not end points.
I love that way of thinking of it. I would, and maybe this is harder to talk about, but it feels to me like garments can be a natural extension of that very black and white guardrail way of thinking. Like, it sort of feels like, okay, as a youth, here's your guardrails and this is right and wrong. And then you're going to make covenants. And I think you can look at wearing garments with that exact same framework. This very, like, someone has laid this all out for you and exactly what it means and exactly how you need to engage with this and exactly how to make it meaningful. And so how do you talk? Can you talk about, do you feel like you can talk about that? Like, how do you approach garments with a healthier mindset, so it doesn't feel so much like a control thing as it does like an actual meaningful expression of your covenants with God? So
I'm working on a book, and in the book I'll be talking about, I'm sort of talking about our development and how we relate to sexuality and faith. And I'm just putting in 3 stages to keep it simple. But, when we're in the early stages, we think very much in black and white and boundaries and the rules, and we're looking for a sense of safety. And so a lot of people relate to garments from that frame because that's the moral frame they operate in. Like, that religious objects are literally sacred. That is, they have literal meaning, and there's not symbolic meaning, and they literally keep them safer. And so for some, that's the world that it feels right and true for them. I think as people move from that kind of obedience frame and black and white, this is how I belong and this is how I'm safe frame, into more self-definition, right? Into this kind of, what does it mean for me? Well, then garments are not about, okay, I must wear them because otherwise I'll be less safe, or socially I'll be rejected. That's kind of what stage 2 is this is how I demonstrate that I belong and that others will see me as acceptable and worthy. In stage 3, then it's more self-defining. Well, what does the garment represent for me? And what is my relationship to it? And how do I think about, I've talked to people who feel like it's oppressive and it feels like it's like, there's just this judgment on their body and it feels very disruptive. I've talked to other people who feel like, no, this is like feeling like I'm wrapped in this sense of God's love and a sense of what my commitments are in my heart, and I love my garments. And so it really depends on, if it's this authority frame versus a personal self-defining frame, it can have a very different feel in terms of what it means for you. But
So how can you go if you find you're kind of in this fear-based mentality, or it feels oppressive? How do you reorient that? Like, if you want it to be meaningful, how do you start over?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to first think in terms of choice, not in terms of I have to. And we talk in terms of you have to, and this is how you do it, and this is why you do it, and if you don't do it, people are going to judge you. And so we do use them more as a form of kind of social control. I mean, I think. And that's not unusual in the earlier stages, like what makes you inside versus outside. We do it with the word of wisdom too. It's not really what's the spirit of that. It's more a way of regulating, are you an insider or an outsider? And so there's a place for that, and I understand it. But I think if you're going to really move into a different relationship to it, then choice is fundamental to it. And what meaning do I give to the garment and to my covenants? And how do I feel that will reinforce what matters to me around the promises I've made?
Yeah.
So it's more creative. It's more self-defining. It's not about regulating everybody else. And it does mean inherently tolerating that other people will have thoughts and feelings about that. Okay?
Yeah. I don't remember if it's is it Brene Brown that says you're not free to say yes unless you're free to say no?
That's right.
Yeah. And it feels like that. Like
Yes.
if the answer has to be yes, then like there's not actual freedom there. So you're going to feel control. That's a really interesting answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of conversation about the problematic things, which I think we have to do. This is our world, and it feels like part of our responsibility to engage with the problems that come up naturally in a sexually conservative culture. But maybe to start wrapping up, could you talk about what are the gifts of sexual conservatism?
Yeah.
Are there gifts?
Sure, there are for sure. I mean, so one thing, let me just talk about the gift of modesty, because I think that there would be nothing worse than the whole world being a nude beach. You know what I'm saying? I have a personal testimony of this. I showed up on one in Europe once unknowingly, and I was like bombarded with how unsexy it really was. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense.
All right.
It really is the opposite of erotic.
It is. It's the
literally
opposite
no
of erotic.
privacy.
And what's erotic is mystery. And the idea of something is special, that it's not just all for show. So I had somebody I worked with who was doing some work in the Middle East, and he was working alongside a Palestinian woman who had her hair covered the whole time that they were working together. And as they were working together week after week, they were growing closer and closer. And, they came from very different worlds culturally and so on, but they were really building a deeper friendship and attraction. And he said, he's seen a lot of women's hair. You know what I'm saying? Like
he's like an American.
Yeah,
just
he's
like
an American
guy.
right? This has never been the symbol of eroticism for him. But her hair was covered the whole time as a function of her religious practice. Well, then one day after work, she, knowing he was looking, removed her hair covering. And he said it was the most erotic moment. He couldn't believe because the meaning is I'm letting you in on something personal. And it was the covering that made it personal. And it was the removing that made it special. And so, we want this simple-minded idea that modesty is just about sexual oppression and repression, and that we are, basically have so much shame, that's why we're covering up. And I just think that's a very simple-minded idea. I think it's a way of regulating public and private. We can certainly do it in ways that are shame-inducing and making people responsible for things they're not responsible for. But it can also be a way of cherishing your body and your sexuality genuinely, and making a distinction between, what is yours and what belongs to others, and what is special to you and what you share with a special other versus what you share with the general public. That's also very different than having shame about your desirability or your attractiveness or your sexuality. You can feel fantastic about all of it and still dress in ways that are not flaunting in any way or really making your sexuality public. You're not, how to say it, denying it or ashamed of it. You can dress attractively and show that you're a sexual being, but still not be working your sexuality in any way. Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I think we're about, I wonder if, just to close, could you paint maybe just what's a positive vision of modesty that maybe we as a faith and faith culture can embrace over the next decade or two?
Yeah, well, I think it has to be in the context of really embracing our theology that embraces the body and sexuality as this loving gift from a loving God, right? Mm. And that we might have joy. And we really have this ability, if through our development, right? So speaking to just the value of sexual conservatism, is that you can't actually create beauty in a marriage if you don't have breaks. Like you have to, it's not just a free for all. Those aren't the happy people.
Breaks, B-R-A-K-E, like pressing on the brake.
Yes, exactly. If you don't, if you being able to manage and regulate your sexuality to create good with it. So there's value in learning how to respond to your impulses wisely and learning how to regulate the body towards the aim of being able to enjoy the sensuality of the body and to create goodness with it. And so if we, as I'm writing about in the book I'm working on, if we can use our theology to understand our goal better, right? And what we're pointing towards, which is really this ability to have deeper embodied joy, even the spirituality of the body, right? That then we can speak about it more honestly as an actual form of cherishing and valuing of the body, right? When we're all terrified of sex and we're doing lip service of how great sex is, but nobody believes it, right? That doesn't really work. But if you actually have your own testimony of what a beautiful thing sexuality can be, right, then you're more naturally able to kind of offer a form of valuing the body and the dignity of the body while not shaming desirability or sexuality or the beauty of the body. It's just a way of cherishing it. And so I think we could speak more in that frame and believe ourselves as we talk that way.
Love it.
Thank you awesome,
so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
Okay, thanks so much for listening, and we really hope that you enjoyed that conversation with Jennifer Finlayson-Fife. A huge thanks again to Jennifer for coming on. And as always, if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get a chance, we'd love for you to leave a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you listen on. It really helps get the word out about Faith Matters, and we really appreciate the support. Thanks again for listening, and as always, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.